Okay, Gordon, we're on to barrier 6, role problems. Can you tell me what you think the recurrent role problems that have come up in your research regarding this?
I think the first issue is getting the volunteers into the right role. That sounds blindingly obvious, but it has to be the right role for the organisation and the right role for the volunteer. So it's win-win volunteering. So that means a sort of careful assessment of what prospective volunteers are bringing along. So you might have a chartered accountant coming along and saying, well, I've retired from all that, but I want to help groups, develop their financial skills and so on. How can I help you? But you equally might get a retired accountant coming along saying, I never want to look at a pile of figures again. I want to do something totally different. So there has to be an early and thorough assessment of what volunteers really want and need. I think another issue is that once you've established the right role for the volunteer is to get them into it as quickly as possible. I've heard of volunteers being kept waiting for 4, 5, 6 weeks. They've been accepted to the role, but there are security or other issues that have to be sorted out first. Now some of that may be inevitable, but I think the thing to do is to constructively offer other tasks they can be doing in the meantime, so you keep the volunteer warm and involved. There's no good, I think, saying, go home for 6 to 8 weeks, we'll get back to you as soon as security and clearance is made. So those are the two things. Get a role that suits both parties and get them into it as quickly as possible. I think looking a little bit further ahead is that at least once a year, let's assume the volunteer is still there is a role review. So on the 12 months I've been told that quite a lot of volunteers anyway turn their thoughts to what they do next at the end of the 12 months, but I think that formally needs to be structured in with the volunteer coordinator or whoever, because managing a volunteer will be very different after 12 months, the odds are, than at the very beginning. So they might want to move sideways, they might want to move up, however, but that annual mark, that annual event should be marked and the roles reviewed.
Okay. What about the issues volunteers might sometimes bring to their roles, which could be construed as being counterproductive?
Right. Well, I think for me this brings up the whole issue of mucking in, because volunteers are often expected to muck in with other volunteers or with paid staff, and this seems to me to be quite a tricky one, and this is partly down to the volunteers, partly down to the organisation, I think. For the purposes of this, there are two sorts of volunteers. There are general volunteers who turn up every Tuesday morning and say, right, here I am, what do you want to do with me? That's the general purpose volunteer. But there are other specialist volunteers who come to do the gardening or badminton coaching or whatever, who come along to do that specifically. And I don't think we should be expecting them to also be mucking in, unless there's a downright emergency or something like that. So I think it's important that the general purpose volunteers muck in, but don't expect your specialist volunteers to do it as well. They should be allowed to concentrate on their work for 80 or 90% of the time anyway.
So really we're talking about clarity, again, clarity of role for the volunteer.
Yes, well that brings up the whole issue, of course, of whether a role should be written or not. And I think there are two camps in the voluntary sector. Most volunteer roles aren't written. I think about 60 to 80% of volunteer roles aren't written. The remainder are. So written roles are the exception rather than the rule. I think in my experience I've worked in groups where we've tried to develop written roles. You don't want a book about roles, you don't want 6 pages of detailed typewritten material, but a side of A4 saying what is expected of volunteers can be really very helpful. Also, it can tell volunteers what they shouldn't be doing, because if they go beyond the role they might be encroaching on somebody else's job or indeed taking it over. So I say there is a big divide in voluntary organisations between those who want their roles written down and lots of other things written down, and those who don't. And both of them, both groups in both camps, think it's perfectly natural to do it their way, but there's not a sort of debate about whether it's appropriate or not. I mean, there may be some organisations, new organisations, campaigning organisations, short-term campaigns, where you're not going to write detailed job descriptions or role descriptions for everybody. But in longer established groups, after 4 or 5 years, perhaps if you're working in an advice centre or something like that, then the volunteer's job description perhaps should be written down and be crystal clear. And the volunteers then also, they know what they're signing up to.
Okay.